Hello. Welcome. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you here. So many familiar faces. I love it. If you don't know me, my name is Marcia Eli, and I have the real joy of welcoming you on behalf of the Center for Brooklyn History, the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, and the Arts and Culture team BPL Presents. Tonight, I'm just curious, who has not been to Center for Brooklyn History ever before? Okay, friends, one person, you will be back many times. We need to talk afterwards. We are so excited tonight to welcome historian Prithi Kanakamedala, or I really should say welcome Prithi back, because Prithi has a long history of being a friend of this institution and the Brooklyn Historical Society before us. In fact, a lot of the generative work that has resulted in the important book and history she'll be discussing tonight happened here. The book is titled Brooklynites, The Remarkable Story of the Free Black Communities That Shaped a Borough, and it explores the impact of Brooklyn's 18th and 19th century free Black community, how their abolitionist work helped define the heart and soul of this borough. And it challenges some of the conventional, and let's just say wrong, assumptions about New York's embrace of the institution of slavery, and shines a spotlight on the visionary free Black men and women of Brooklyn who fought against it. We are enormously fortunate that CBH's chief historian, Dominique Jean-Louis, is tonight's moderator. Following their discussion, there will be time to take questions from all of you. Our ushers will bring a mic to you, so please wait for that. Raise your hand and wait for that. And you probably saw as you came in that Brooklynites is on sale at the CBH shop right over here. Prithi will be signing books after the discussion in the front there where you came in. So now let me share just a few details about our guests and turn the stage over to them. Prithi Kanakamedala is professor of history at Bronx Community College, CUNY. She also teaches at CUNY Graduate Center, where she is the inaugural faculty coordinator of the Public Scholarship Practice Space. As a public historian, in addition to her work here, Prithi has worked with Dance Space Project, City Lore, and Weeksville Heritage Center, among others. Dominique Jean-Louis is the chief historian of the Center for Brooklyn History. Previously, she was the associate curator of history exhibitions at New York Historical Society, where she co-curated Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow in 2018, and in 2022, Our Composite Nation, Frederick Douglass's America, and Black Dolls. Dominique regularly writes and lectures on Blackness in America, schools and education, and New York City history. It's such a joy to have you, to know that we are anticipating this conversation, which is, I know, going to be amazing. So please help me welcome Prithi and Dominique to the stage.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know Tuesday nights in my house is a bit of a challenge, so I really appreciate it. Dominique asked me to read a little bit of the book before we get started, so that is what I will be doing with the Ratzer map behind us. Isabella was just 9 years old when the British cartographer Bernard Ratzer created the plan of the town of Brooklyn and part of Long Island for military purposes in 1766, a full 9 years before the American Revolution. It is difficult to map her daily routine as a young girl, but she was almost certainly prohibited from the normality of childhood curiosity and play, and her mobility was restricted given her enslaved status. When she did move, she would have done so across a terrain, as seen in this map, so sublime that it belied the genocidal violence to which the land was witness. Although little remained of the Lenni Lenape collective way of life and its people, and the Munsi-speaking Karnasi had been annihilated some 80 years earlier by the Dutch, then English, colonizers, the occupied land still consisted of hills and troughs, natural waterways with an abundance of oysters and corn, orchards, and other crops across expansive agricultural land. The Brooklyn Ferry, which now provided in 1766 passage to its residents from colonial Kings County to Manhattan, but again, it is unlikely that Isabella possessed this basic freedom to travel across the East River. Instead, as a child in 18th century Kings County, then part of the British North American colonies, Isabella was expected to work in an agrarian economy mostly led by Dutch and then British farmers until her death. Ratz's map tells the stories of countless enslaved people of African descent whose labor made possible the discernible large tracts of land you see here. But this map also represents the land that Isabella and others would ultimately liberate themselves from through escape. Like so many people of African descent, Isabella used the chaos of the American Revolution to seize her freedom. The brief 2 lines in the military ledger created by the British, the Book of Negroes, cannot tell us the conditions of Isabella's escape, whether she ran from her enslaver by day or night, alone or with assistance from others. During her escape, did she hear the night song of the town's crickets or the daily wrens that flew overhead? Or, as the adrenaline consumed her, did she feel the fields of barley, corn, oats, and rye under her feet? Perhaps these details all felt too inconsequential during flight. But what we can glean from the archives is the why. On the basis of the 2 Isabella's ages, there is an adult Isabella and a younger Isabella immediately next to each other in this book, and the racist description of the adult Isabella as a stout wench, that is, a Black woman of childbearing age, or in this case, with child, Isabella expressed a basic maternal and human instinct, and that was to protect her unborn child, or possibly a newborn, of only a few days or weeks from a life of traumatic violence that only slavery afforded. As an enslaved woman, Isabella would have automatically passed her status to her daughter. Running away, therefore, represented an act of unconditional love. Isabella's maternal bond was deeply rooted in her humanity, so starkly antithetical to a system that viewed her both and her child as an extension of the land on which she labored. Isabella's act of defiance, like that of countless others who would serve as Black loyalists, and their willingness to risk life for freedom, destroyed the fantasy that white Brooklynites would later tell themselves about the borough's past and its, quote, benign, end quote, form of slavery. Namely, that enslaved people of African descent, quote, caught the infection of disorder and lawlessness from loyalist occupation during the American Revolution and without purpose simply went in search of adventures, end quote. This story begins at the end of a major chapter of US history. At the end of the American Revolution, Brooklyn was a slaveholding capital, and it is within this context that a free Black community at the town's most northwestern tip would begin to contour the landscape and imbue the land with radical possibilities of freedom. The stories of enslaved women like Isabella invite us to meditate on the land that became known as Brooklyn, to contemplate it as a series of unwritten spaces, to examine the right to that space and the meaning of place that Brooklynites free and enslaved would assign to it throughout its formation in the early to mid-19th century as it emerged as the city of Brooklyn. Thank you.
There we go. I think we're on. Hello, everybody, and forgive me for using my privilege as the moderator. I feel like I'm at a concert of my favorite rock star, like play my favorite song. That was certainly one of my favorite passages reading your book, and especially as a historian myself, I was really wowed by the fact that this narrative you build about Isabella, about her child, about the terrain she's escaping via, boiled down to it, you're looking at 2, 3 sources. This is a map. This is 2 lines of a military ledger. And we get so much of an evocative reading of her life from just those couple of sources. And I happen to know, because I know you, that this is something you teach to your students, right? This sense of, well, what did this space smell like? What did it look like? What did it sound like? And I'm just wondering if we can start off now, given that we just heard these beautiful words, how do you start to spin out this narrative? Is it at the point when you're looking at the Ratzer map, when you're looking at this military ledger? Is it when you're sitting down to write? How do you start to build a narrative off of just these kind of very seemingly straightforward primary sources? And in this case, only a couple of them, the very few we have.
Thank you, Dominique. Gosh, how do you start? So I think the first instinct as a writer and as a historian is to honor our ancestors, honor the past, honor the dead. So I think I'm always thinking about if there's not enough in the archives that I can recover in order to sort of build a full life for that person, how do I then think creatively around that. And I think one of the best ways you do it is exactly that thing that I do in the classroom, which is talk about, well, we don't have a portrait, we don't have census records, we don't have all of the things that, create histories for great white men, but what we can do, what we can absolutely recover and sort of use to honor these people is think about the kinds of places that they would have passed through. And so one of the ways we do that is to think about our own senses, right? We are constantly, as New Yorkers, walking upon the lives of past New Yorkers, of people who roamed the very same streets, might be a few, feet high in terms of where the concrete is at today. And so how do you honor those spaces? And that was just one way I got at it. And, I never want to have folks think I came up with it in any way. There are dozens of historians that I can name who do similar things. So yes, thinking about where the silences are and how you then honor that person and just get around the silences of the archives.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to go about it. And also in some ways, the more difficult path. In the book, you use this phrase, unwritten spaces. And, I think about, you could have written about the 1970s. You could have written about any time period. How did you come to write about, this book's topic, the free Black communities that shaped a borough? As we heard from that reading, you're maybe not from here, from across the pond. Why Black Brooklyn? And specifically, and hearing you speak a little bit more about, you use your own humanity to kind of write into these narratives. Once you arrived at this topic, how has researching this history changed the way you look at the city?
Absolutely, thank you. I'm not from around here. I am a very proud Scouser. I was born in Liverpool, England. So to answer that question in 2 parts, one was, this book comes out of a project that began 15 years ago, and it was called In Pursuit of Freedom, and it began in this very space. And I think Kate from Oil is here tonight, but I can't. Oh, hey, Kate, who was the original project manager on that public history project. And so, like most public history projects, Dominique, you can talk about this as well. Somebody in the city or somebody somewhere provides some funding and says, we want a cultural organization or institution to tell this story, and you need to build a team around it. So that at that time was the Bloomberg administration, which tells you how old this project is, going into then the de Blasio administration, who were offering funding to 3 cultural organizations to tell the anti-slavery movement of Brooklyn. And why Brooklyn? Because at that point, and it's changed so much in the last decade, Brooklyn's history was really undertold. So many historians would say they were New York City historians, but really they were telling the history of Manhattan. And so it was really important, I think, for the 3 cultural organizations, Brooklyn Historical Society, which again is this building now, Center for Brooklyn History, part of the library, Weeksville Heritage Center, which is still thriving, and a theatre company, Irondale Ensemble Project, to be able to tell that story. That's the kind of practical stuff of how I got involved in telling this story. I was the historian and curator for it. But in terms of a much more, I think, deeper explanation, so I grew up, and my older brothers always make fun of me, on that sort of Gen X millennial divide of the late 70s, early 80s in Liverpool, England. And when people say, well, why New York, history, why don't you do British history? It's because if you know the history of Liverpool and you know the histories of New York, they're so intertwined. Deindustrialization, union busting, moving of waterfront jobs, the rest of the country and the city not investing in certain neighborhoods and what that means, over policing of neighborhoods. I grew up in a very parallel universe. It was just across the pond. So I think the idea of joint struggles, joint histories, where we find sort of shared humanity, common humanity, is what really drives me as a historian. So, I find so much hope in thinking about folks who lived centuries before me, but were organizing and mobilizing and creating the kind of city that they wanted to see. And they were doing it along themes, that are close to all of us. What do we want our schools to look like? What do we want our neighborhoods to look like? What does property ownership look like? Voting, citizenship, employment. And so I think that is what has sort of kept me going in terms of there's more to tell of this story. And as a public historian, the exhibit is well gone. The walking tour still exists in some form, but I felt as though the story needed to be told in this format.
That's so compelling. And it is kind of, I was thinking about this as I was thinking about my questions, like it really is the same room. And it happens to be the first time I stepped foot in this building was to see that exhibition. I'm wondering if we could all jointly imagine having that exhibition in the space, if you have a favorite object that helped you do some storytelling around the history that would become this book 10 years ago.
I'm only laughing because the exhibit came down 5 years ago, and I can't remember what I did last week. So I'm trying to remember the exhibit, and I'm trying to remember an object that was in it. I don't know, it wasn't an object, and it was totally the design firm, and that's why I say this with no kind of like British self-deprecation. I truly mean this. It's such a privilege to put a name on a book, one's own name, because really so many of the ideas and dialogue came out of being in community with other people. And so what I remember about that exhibit the most was I had a whole cast of characters. It was not as finessed as this, where I had the 4 families down. And the exhibit designer, bless them, were like, no visitor's going to understand this density. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to take that tome that you've written, and I really did. I wrote like 400 pages on the history of Brooklyn and all these people that made Brooklyn what it is. And they were like, and for each part, you're going to choose 5 people maximum. And if you work in exhibit design, this is how it goes. And then you're going to choose 200 of your best words about each person, and it's all going to be okay. And you're not going to lose any meaning, and the visitor's totally going to get it. And of course, I was like, oh my God, was that a tweet at the time? I don't even know. I was like, okay, let me figure this out. And then what they did on top of it was, in order to get that information, you had to pull on a pulley and the screen moved. And their explanation was that you are somehow honoring the labor of those people, right? You're having to work at getting the information about that person. And I just thought, how beautiful. As a geeky historian, I would never have thought of that. But I love the idea of visitors not just passively coming in, but actually physically doing something.
Yeah, it's wild seeing what a difference it is encountering the narrative in a book and then also how you move through an exhibition space. It's 2 completely different experiences, especially because I read most of this on the subway and it's very different than this room. Thinking about that shift then, I recently learned, you said in another book talk, which I was lucky enough to attend, that you had initially thought you were going to be a playwright. And so I put that in a weird way. You had trained as a playwright. And clearly it shows that narrative means a lot to you. And for those who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, it's structured in the way that there are four families, and we kind of move through these four families to understand a little bit more about Brooklyn's history. And it's a really interesting and useful way to move through change over time. At what point did you decide that it was going to be these four families? Did it harken back to that exhibit work, or how did you decide when structuring this book that that is how you wanted to tell the story? Because you could have done, pick a time period and move through it chronologically.
Yeah, I think it came like most folks who do any form of writing at the most randomest of times when I was stuck and I just didn't know what I was doing. I was co-writing. We had a little writing group, me and my dear friend, Gabrielle Bendanaviani, and I was thinking, I don't know how to structure this thing. I don't know what to do with it. So I think something deep down, I did. I studied playwriting in my early 20s. That was actually plan A. I was at the Soho Theatre and the Royal Court Theatre back in London in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I'd given it up because I was like, oh, you need to actually make money at some point, and this is clearly not going to do anything. And so I went back to graduate school. And I think it was a response to, I want to tell these four family stories. I actually don't have enough archival material to be able to do it. And more importantly, I want people to be able to read it and be interested and be invested in these four families and what's going to happen to them. Great playwrights will always talk about, narrative structure, about protagonists and antagonists. We have no better antagonists than white supremacy in the 19th century. Outcomes and how it all gets resolved. And I think I kind of clung to that and came up with this.
Yeah, it kind of reads that way. It almost feels like one of those sci-fi books where you have these different teams fighting the same enemy, where they just have different tactics, they're different communities on kind of like, okay, we can only get this much freedom. How do we maximize it? Or how do we change the fact we can only get this much freedom? That thrust of there is a common enemy, or at least a common limitation, despite these four families living in very different parts of Brooklyn, living through the different time periods. It feels connected because what they're up against is a city trying to figure itself out, trying to land on a power structure, and their job is to get as high up on that power structure, or at least not be pressed down on that power structure as they can. And you mentioned that there were so few sources. I'm wondering, as you went about the research of trying to figure out this time period and accurately tell the story, were there some sources you sought out? Which are the ones where you knew, okay, I want to know more about this. I want to get really sunk into this. And as is usually the case, what are the ones that came to you by chance? What did you kind of, or if you're spiritual, which ones did the spirit lead you to?
So the obvious ones of any historian who's working, or any researcher that's working on 19th century Brooklyn or New York, is the census records. That was the most obvious one to go to for me. And then at Center for Brooklyn History, they have the richest collection of city directories. And I was an English major as an undergraduate, and I'm obsessed with print culture and type. So I would just pour through the city directories, and again, to get a sense of how were folks in this time period being captured in public records. And I think the advantage or the joy of it's taken me 14 years from first stepping into an archive in this building to the book coming out. I think the joy of that is technology also moves on, right? So many of the sources of the archives that I used have been digitized since. So where back in the day I was on the microfilm machine going through daily newspapers of the Long Island Star, which is the oldest newspaper here in Brooklyn. 2 years ago, I was putting in my keyword search, and it was just all coming up, and I was like, "Oh, look how quick this goes when you can just do that." So, I think that to me sort of changed the way I wrote as well, because you could suddenly, enter people's most personal details, their probate records, land deeds, in ways that really was an act of labor even 10 years ago as a researcher. And I think the one gem that we were sort of never looking for was my colleague and I Samantha Gibson. We left Brooklyn eventually, went up to Yale, to the archives there, to have a look at what they had on Brooklyn. And if you know the history of this neighborhood, or you've heard of Henry Ward Beecher and his very famous family, they have a real, or rather his legacy has a real stronghold of how we think about freedom. If you go to Cadman Plaza, the statue is there. And so I think as I was much younger then, two much younger women of color, me and Sam Gibson, we were really keen to think about, we don't believe in white saviors. White saviors don't feature in our lives. So how would this have worked for women of color, enslaved women who were trying to buy their freedom and having to go to this super famous man called Henry Ward Beecher to have them help him? And so when we went to the Yale archives, was not looking for it, was going through this stack of family papers and then came across, honestly, it's so kind of banal in its existence. It's gorgeous. It's an account book from an enslaved woman at the time called Pomona Bryce, in which she has written that her family is still enslaved. She lives in Brooklyn, and she's fundraising to get money. And it's literally a list of names and how much, and there's like a 19th century version of a bank statement at the back. And it was so moving. I think Sam and I, not the most emotional of people, but we're near to tears because we were like, this is it. This was the truth of the story the entire time. Black women were always at the center of this struggle, always at the center of activism, always organizing. It's just that somewhere the archives have just sort of forgotten them. And so how do we put that back?
Yeah, it's the question of agency, right? Not the kind of things that someone else deigns to leave in the traces of history about you, but the stamp you put yourself. I was here, I existed, this is what mattered to me. That's a really powerful document. It's making me quite emotional. On the flip side, are there any sources, primary sources, or kind of other kinds of documents or kinds of historical evidence that you desperately wanted to find in order to be able to fully tell the story? I would imagine centering families, there's so many wormholes, and let's look at the uncle and let's try to find things. Are there any trails you went down hoping to find something that didn't yet produce any fruit for you?
Thank you for that. I think even though obviously my instinct is to know there are going to be no portraits of any of these women, I was so desperate to find one. The nature of archives, especially for people who have been underrepresented, is that a lot of these archives might live on informally. So even if they're not at the repository, even if they are not, within the archives collection with the finding aid, they might be in somebody's home still. And so I was extremely eager to see if I could find a portrait. And of course, it never happened, which is why there are no portraits of any of the women in this book. But I just want to say, the other side of that was I was also really eager to find the descendants of some of these families. The end of the book talks about, history's not dead. And this history certainly is not dead. It still continues to shape exactly how we live our lives as New Yorkers. And so I got a beautiful email in the middle of a really sort of busy teaching semester 2 days ago from somebody who now lives in Virginia, but was like, I am a descendant of one of those families in your book. And just, trying to figure out how we can talk. I'm so sort of committed to when you do community engagement, what does that look like? Does it look respectful? Does it look reciprocal? What are the families getting out of this? But just that email coming in, I was like, this is magical. That's what I wanted this book to be, for it to be an invitation to further dialogue about what this all means.
And that's really beautiful too, because knowing you work so long on this book and in this subject, I'm sure to some extent these families, these characters felt like yours. They felt like you were kind of living with them. And so to discover and get a sense that no, these families also have this other afterlife that's not the one of you tracing them down in the archive, but is still living among us. That's incredibly powerful. You mentioned this came during a busy teaching semester. And again, knowing you well, I know that your teaching guides a lot of how you think as a historian and how you craft narrative. And I'm wondering if there are ways that this book kind of would have been a different way if you weren't teaching or weren't teaching where you teach, on kind of how your students' perspectives as New Yorkers almost entirely shape how you're thinking about your audience or how you're thinking about your narrative.
Thank you. It shapes it a lot. When you're dealing with, I shouldn't say dealing, that's a terrible way to phrase it. When you're being in community with your students in a classroom twice a week or once a week for 3 hours a day, of course it shapes the way you think. So I teach up at Bronx Community College, part of the CUNY system. And unlike all good New Yorkers, most of my students are from the Bronx, and they could care less about Brooklyn, right? They've never, some of them have never left the borough. They're like, this is the best borough on the planet. I have no need. I maybe have a job in Manhattan, but I am not going there, professor. And their face, when I take them to Weeksville Heritage Center, they're like, we might as well be going to LA. Like, where are you taking us, woman? But the point of that is it forces you, and I think it is a really, really good challenge to think about why should any of this matter to them. They are busy human beings who have busy lives and are juggling all sorts. In addition to education, non-traditional students are also sustaining most of the economy in New York through work. So why should they care, right? So what is the invitation I say to my students? So what? Why do we care? And I think that then, I was like, I keep saying to them, so what? Stop writing me an essay. So what? Why should you care? And I'm like, oh God, I need to apply it to me. So what? Why should anybody care about this? And I don't mean that in a flippant or disrespectful way. I mean, as in, I think the onus is on me, if I'm putting my name on this book, to really think through past is present and what is not just the historical legacy, but what continues to shape and contour our lives today and the challenges of our lives. And so, yes, might live in a different borough, might never come here, might be a completely different time period, but so much of the themes and their voices, my CUNY students, are throughout this book, I would say.
Yeah, that really connected with me, having remembered my time in the classroom and often teaching a lot of these subjects. I would often use stand-up comedy clips if we were talking about white supremacy or we're talking about history. A lot of times a joke is actually a really incisive way to get us at the crux of, well, what are we talking about and what are the stakes? And I was so taken with, in this book, how you kind of flip that and you're introducing us to 19th century humor and how that shapes the lives of some of the families in this book. You give us this really vivid picture of the Kroger family and a particular broadside of print they would have encountered, the Brooklyn abolition print. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how humor at the time is shaping the lives of people who are trying to exist at the time. And just a little bit maybe about how you found that particular document, that particular piece of historical evidence.
So Brooklyn Abolition, and again, thinking about community, and my name is on the book, but honestly, there's so much other people's labor that is in this book. It is part of the New York Historical Society collections. So an archivist has gone, sort of put the metadata in, put it as part of the library catalog, and then somebody like myself has just typed in Brooklyn, and it's come up. Brooklyn Abolition was part of racist caricatures that happened across the Atlantic world at this time in the 19th century when Black freedom was at stake. So it's a really violent, racist, kind of disgusting print. But the reason for me mentioning it is because it was quite big.
You give the dimensions in the book.
Yeah.
It's 12 by 17.
It's 12 by 17. So this isn't like a small, it's not about the size of this book. And if you think about the way in which windows worked in that time, right, it wasn't a full pane of glass. It was those sort of smaller sheets of glass that they would put together to make a full window. The point of telling you that is the print shop is right here in Brooklyn. It's in what we call today Dumbo. And so thinking about, and again, as a child who grew up in the late 70s, early 80s in Liverpool, where, wasn't all unicorns and rainbows, my family was also subject to intense racist abuse at that time. What that meant for a family, like you said, who's just trying to exist, thrive. They are free Black people. They have a right to the land. They are Americans. They are Brooklynites. To be able to walk down the street and encounter those racist images staring back at them, created by their neighbors, right? And I'm not talking about sort of Brooklyn that's stretching from Coney Island all the way up to Dumbo. I'm talking about a 1 square mile who you probably know who created that racist woodcut. You know who the printer is, because he's also producing the newspaper for that time period. And what that means in terms of how you navigate life. But on the flip side of that, right, racist humor, caricature, I also want to say, and it's something that I talk about constantly, all of these activists, all of these families that were paving the way, well, not all of them, that's a stretch, but some of them were hilarious, right? They had comedy genes. William Wilson, who's an educator who lives here in the 1850s, shapes the way education looks here in the city or in the borough, is writing constantly for Frederick Douglass's paper. And his writing is exquisite. He's one of the funniest writers I have met in the archives. So thinking about how, even if you think about if you have organizer friends or activist friends today who are creating work on the ground, they're some of the funniest people you know, right? Because there is therapy in that kind of humor when you're doing serious work. So thinking of that as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to flip it to that, some of the families who cover the family businesses, they're shopkeepers, they run boarding houses. And that's within the world of what they could have been, right? And I came across this when I worked on the Black Dolls exhibit, where these women could have been composers if someone had given them a piano. These women could have been artists if someone handed them a paintbrush, but what they had was a needle and thread. And you really do get across in the book how much that, they are shopkeepers or they are journalists and activists, but that's not all that they could have been. This is kind of where they landed, which is really beautiful, or at least poignant to think about the possibilities that maybe were not fully realized in their time. And I just wanted to say I'm so thankful for what you said about archivists, because I know that's often a theme we encounter, right? Is that a historian will say, I found this never before seen document in the archive. And it's, well, if you found it in the archive, that means someone's donated it. An archivist put in the metadata and processed the collection. And so I'm really appreciative of that kind of acknowledgement. And I'm sure our archivists who are here and members of our library team feel the same. And we're seeing some images generally of the book and the kind of genesis, but also from our archival collection. And so much of the research for this book took place upstairs. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned the kind of change in digital technology, but there's also theoretically or probably changes in you. How has your approach to the archive changed, either as you're developing this narrative, as technology changes, or even as your own sense of how to search changes? Has it changed the way you move in the archive?
No, not a lot. In terms of, I think I still do the broad sweep of everything, again, because a lot of what I write about, my next project looks at a family in Manhattan, and I have the same sort of challenges. There's not a lot of archival material. So, yes, technology has made it much easier, right? Of course, that keyword search is a dream, and then you just print it, and you got a beautiful PDF, and it's not, I have so many notebooks from the early 2000s in which I'm like, I have no idea what I wrote with that pencil, right? Because my handwriting is awful. But yes, it's changed in terms of that. But in terms of my the way I approach archives, it's always broad. What was the newspapers? What were the newspapers writing about that time period? What was the weather like? What did it look like? If I walk down the street in this time period that I want to write about, what are the shops? What are the businesses? Where would I be shopping? As a probably lower middle class person, who knows? As a woman of color, how would I have navigated any of this? So I don't think it's changed dramatically. because, again, shout out to archivists and librarians. They've always been doing this work. So I feel as though it's just that keyword search has become so much easier.
That's so interesting that, especially now, I imagine it's quite a new experience to be at the beginning of a process since you've been working on this project for so long. Thinking about this project, and again, thinking about where we are, we're here in this building, but we're also in Brooklyn Heights, and obviously such an important character or person in this book is Elizabeth Gloucester, whose boarding house was just around the corner. And we don't have a portrait of her, as you mentioned, but there's a lot more about her in the archive than a lot of other folks. And you're very careful throughout these stories of these families to call out class. Like, there's a reason why you could write a story about the Krogers and not neighbors of theirs that we don't even know their names. How did you kind of navigate the class aspect of this? Because on the one hand, you're dealing with a group of people who are marginalized in so many ways, but find themselves in positions of opportunity in comparison to their neighbors and others. Was that hard to navigate or hard to narrate as you're trying to explain, here are their opportunities, but those aren't the entirety of opportunities at the time?
So as a Brit, I think I am obsessed and sort of imbued with class consciousness, right? There is no way you grow up in Britain in the late 70s, early 80s into the 90s and not have any idea of how class works. And so I was extremely sort of intentional in thinking through class in this book. Elizabeth Gloucester she dies in 1883, one of the richest women in the United States, and she's done so through amassing real estate. But I think I hope I am very careful to point out throughout the book, for every Elizabeth Gloucester, there were dozens of ordinary women of African descent sustaining the economy in really informal ways. And that's why at the end of the book, I actually end with the obituary of a working class woman who couldn't afford her sanitation taxes. You know, the newspaper is constantly calling her out, being like, unpaid, you know, sort of like a medieval shame thing. And her name is Matilda Cultbreath. And thank God for the black press at that time, because they do the obituary and they say she lived in Brooklyn. She was ordinary, you know, not a lot of achievement. She wasn't the richest woman in the United States, but she labored and organized and thought about the ways in which she could leave a better world behind. And so I think honoring that was crucial. I also think, you know, the brilliant Brent Staples has also written about Elizabeth Gloucester, and, you know, you can see that in the New York Times, again, Google search, and sort of contours her early life in really moving ways. I think what I wanted to do, and where the book is definitely different from the project, is think about her life as a whole, as a woman who, she's a mother to several children. Those children, you know, will end up fighting over that estate. And thinking about what it meant for her as an organizer, but also as a mother. And I say that because the thing that changed for me in the 14 years was I became a mum as well. And thinking about what those impulses are. So the one big thing is always that Elizabeth Gloucester gave $10 to John Brown. She writes a letter, she encloses her money, and she goes, go start the revolution. And it's brilliant. And it's like, I think it emancipates so many people from their own prejudices of what they think 19th century women sounded like and did. But then she has this one line at the end of the letter, and she says, you know, your letter alleviated my drooped spirits, or something similar. And when I was researching the book, I was like, what was happening to Elizabeth Gloucester at that time? Yes, absolutely. You know, this nation is a mess when she's writing in 1859. You have, you know, John Brown, Dred Scott, just this like onslaught of white supremacist attacks about what it means to be a black person in this country. But then when I was looking at burial records at Greenwood Cemetery, it showed up that she'd actually buried her 2-year-old son, Alfred, in the same year. And to think, I think, very deeply about what loss meant on a really personal level, and how she kind of maybe channeled that into a larger political cause. So again, to slow down, you know, and not make these folks sort of exceptional always, because exceptionalism, as so many writers and activists tell us, have all of their pitfalls. But to think about them as humans, whole humans with their own vulnerabilities, with their own lives, who are sort of navigating how crap life can be sometimes, navigating pediatric outcomes, especially if you're a Black person in the 19th century, navigating her own health outcomes, and then putting it back into the context of, yeah, she was a badass. She gave money to John Brown.
That's so fascinating. So I'm going to be turning it over to questions from you all in just a moment. So if you have a question, start narrowing it down so it's succinct and clear by the time you ask it. But I'm going to take my opportunity to ask a last question, which is a little bit self-service. You know, as a public historian, we are constantly using anniversaries to kind of look back and give us an opportunity to kind of think back to particular eras. And we're about to have like an avalanche of anniversaries. So next year, 2025, is being acknowledged as the 400th anniversary of at least the island of Manhattan. The following year is the nation's semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of 1776. And then the following year marks 200 years since the end of slavery in New York City or New York State. So there's going to be a lot of looking back, and to kind of put that why this matters question on you, I feel as though histories like these will be so useful kind of moving forward. Like you said, there are fewer books about Brooklyn's history than you think. And so this will add so much to the canon. But as a city and as a country, we're going to be doing a lot of looking back over the next few years. Where do you start to think about this in the larger picture in terms of maybe for Brooklyn, maybe for New York, maybe for America? How does this story, or how do these stories help us think differently about ourselves?
God, Dominique, you
Sorry.
said these were softball questions. That's not a softball.
I did say that. I lied.
I think, like all historians, and I know you are of the similar training, Dominique, that you start with the people, right? People's history for the people, by the people. And I think all of these histories, again, going back to my amazing students, both at CUNY Graduate Center and at Bronx Community College, I have very few students, I've been teaching there for a decade, who say, I really want to learn the history of all the presidents of the United States. I'm yet to encounter that student. They want to know the history of what their peoples were doing, of what their ancestors, of what New Yorkers past were doing. And so I think all of this has to belong to what ordinary people did, both to create the city and this nation.
Yeah, I think that is definitely what we find in this book too, because you pay so much attention to not just the Elizabeth Gloucesters, but the neighbors as well, the Cuthbert, that we kind of can see ourselves in this book, even though these are specific families. I think everyone here can feel that I'm part of a community, or I'm part of a city, and also what will our legacy be. So thank you so much for writing the book and for this conversation. And I'd love to turn it to you all. I'm sure you're full of questions, as I have been reading this book. And we can start to, I think there's a microphone coming around. We can start to hear some of your questions.
Oh, thank you. I kind of have like two questions, actually three, but two of them go together. You mentioned about somebody who buried their 2-year-old child, which I was really interested in, because I was wondering, did you get any input from churches, or where people went to church at, or at least got together for religious services? And so then, if she buried her child, where did she bury him at? And then there's, as the maps that you showed, there's some of the streets I know, but there was one called Cripple Bush, and I'm wondering how many of those streets don't exist anymore? Okay.
So the way in which we know that she buried her child was not from Black church records. It's from Greenwood Cemetery's records. Like Dominique was indicating, the Gloucesters are an exceptional family. The whole family is still buried at Greenwood Cemetery, and it is a gorgeous site. She paid a lot of money for that tombstone. So again, thinking about archives and digitization, if you type in Gloucester, Alfred pops up, and it shows that he's 2 years old. And so that wasn't from church records. But of course, there are numerous Black churches that are featured in the book and still exist today. Bridge Street, Concord, Shiloh, they're all still around. I just never went into their archives. Again, that kind of research, I think, when done well, requires years and decades of community building, trust building. Who am I? I'm the outsider. What am I doing in the archives? And I just never, if done well, and I wanted to do it justice, I don't think this book would have been written now, right? It would have taken another 10, 15 years. So not to say that the records don't exist, it's just that I have not written about them. The other element about what streets exist and what don't, so the book touches upon it. There are lots of streets that still exist named after slaveholders in Brooklyn. You can find that easily now. Lenny Bernardo wrote a book about it decades ago, Brooklyn by Name. And if you just look up in Brooklyn Heights, multiple neighborhoods named after slaveholders, Prospect Lefferts Gardens. There were lots of streets that have since disappeared. That is true. And I think that's why I wanted to put the maps in the book to show folks, William Hodges, who's the second family who appears, was living on trendy Bedford in Williamsburg, way before Williamsburg was Williamsburg, because he saw the potential of the land and, how full circle. It's totally gentrified and looks completely different. But people have constantly be going to that part of Brooklyn and being like, this looks like it could be something for somebody. Lots of street changes in the book. And I hope there's enough maps to kind of navigate people.
Yeah, and I know that we have an extensive map collection here, and that's a helpful way to start to track the change over time, because sometimes you can encounter a street and not be able to find it anywhere else. Other questions? Ooh, lots.
Professor P. It's an honor to be here, and congratulations on your book. I had two questions. Can you explain the difference, because, slavery was outlawed in New York State, 1827. And when you look at the population figures in terms of blacks, you see enslaved persons and free blacks. Can you explain that complexity? Because, there's been many, stories, well, not many, but some stories of like black people like William Brown, who created the African Grove Theater in 1821, who was a free black from the Caribbean. Can you explain that complexity about enslaved persons and free blacks? And also, in your research, there's like a new area of research with some black historians that are looking at history pre-1619. Did you encounter any historical, records about blacks prior to, the 1619?
Thank you. Let me start with the first one. So the complexity of the gradual emancipation period is when the Krogers live, and they are trying to figure out what slavery looks like in a land of freedom, right? The first Gradual Emancipation Act in New York State is passed in 1799, and it's going to take 28 long years for slavery to end. There was no free black person or even enslaved person living in Brooklyn who was waiting for slavery just to end, thinking again about organizing. They are constantly organizing and thinking about, what does our community need to look like in order to not just survive, but thrive? What do we need in terms of organizations and institutions in order to make that possible? And so I've had the question before, well, where did free black people come from? And I always say there's no D on the end. These people will rise from the dead and shake you, right? The relationship to slavery was so long ago that they really were free and trying to figure out what that even meant in the context of the United States. So some folks may have got their freedom by their elders fighting in the American Revolution as black loyalists. So they are the children of those freedom seekers. Some folks might have moved from other places, right? Again, New York was not a bastion of liberty. It's the second to last northern state to abolish slavery. So you have all those folks in Pennsylvania, all those folks in Massachusetts, who after the American Revolution are enjoying freedom and really organizing and contouring what freedom is going to look like. Moving to New York, because of course, New York City has always had this reputation of being an exciting place, a place in which money is made, a place in which dreams come true. You know, it's fast-paced. It's, again, it's where slaveholders will come in the mid-19th century on their vacation, thinking about tourists in this city. So the idea of New York has not changed dramatically. And I think, so in this time period, that free Black community is absolutely figuring out, how do we create a school? How do we create a place of worship? And it's not just going to be a place of worship. It'll be a site in which matters of politics and faith come together. How do we take care of one another should one of us, die? So, you were saying, Dominique, about folks were looking out for each other in the absence of sort of welfare schemes or any kind of safety net, like Social Security or, unemployment or disability. What did that look like? They created a mutual aid organization that said racial capitalism is never going to allow us to reflect our talents or capabilities, right? This day job might kill us, but if we all pay into this scheme, I know my partner and my children are well taken care of. And so I think thinking about that, and then nobody by July 4th, 1827 in New York is waiting for the emancipation moment, right? They are ready to celebrate. And I'm so sorry, Fahim. I've done a full day of teaching, and I have 100% forgotten what the second part of your question was.
You find any research of Black people
Oh, thank you.
pre-1619?
Yeah. I did not, and I'll tell you why. The work has been done by the brilliant historian Craig Wilder, who is up at MIT, Covenant with Color. That was the book when I started this project. That, I really do mean it when I say there was such a handful of people writing about Brooklyn. And Dr. Wilder really does set out what that looked like in colonial Kings County and what the lives of people of African descent would have looked like alongside the Lenape. So, didn't, but obviously shout it out and pay honor to it.
Hello. I realize that in discussing the Black church and social change, there is some delicacy that must be observed. I actually studied that when I was in college. But you cannot separate the freedom of Black people from the church. So I'm wondering, did you at all touch on any of the churches that influenced the families that you studied? I was just recently at Siloam Presbyterian Church, which started on Cranberry Street and actually entertained and raised funds for John Brown. So I'm very curious about that aspect.
Thank you. I do. So the Krogers are just one of many families who will establish the AME Church, which is today Bridge Street. So the first half of the book really does talk about the establishment of the church and what it meant. Again, matters of faith and politics, a place for folks to come together to think about, what does it mean to be a Brooklynite? How do we organize ourselves? How do we create the kind of institutions we want? So Bridge Street heavily features in the beginning, and then because of the Gloucesters, again, John will come and he'll be a pastor at Shiloh Presbyterian, talking about that. When I move into the latter part, the mid-19th century, and I'm thinking about freedom seekers coming to Brooklyn, all of those Black churches, of course, feature heavily and are honored because it was those folks that were fundraising heavily for freedom seekers coming here. And of course, today Plymouth kind of overshadows everything, but I was sure to lay out, these are the folks who were always doing the work.
Nope, I missed. Sorry.
I was wondering what kind of interaction there was between all these different free communities. You know, like my family lives in Harlem. I grew up in Brooklyn. They would never come to Brooklyn, you know, if I wasn't here. So I was wondering, like, what mechanisms enabled these different free communities to connect with one another? Like, I know there was a free Black community in Staten Island. So I'm wondering, like, did they, you know, communicate with each other, or were they just very isolationist?
Thank you. So I was thinking about all the different free Black communities that existed in the 19th century: Seneca Village, Weeksville. There's one up in Williamsburg, obviously, that I read about, one out in Sandy Ground, Staten Island. You know, and this is what I say truly, and I mean it when I say to do this kind of work, you have to be in community with other folks doing the work. I recently learned, because somebody else was working on the Seneca Village records, that Elizabeth Gloucester probably owned some semblance of land up in Seneca Village. And so in the same way, I think that these Brooklynites were making connections, even if the connections were not obvious. Maybe they weren't going around to each other's houses every week, right? But that they were making political connections constantly and going across that East River. I think that is mirrored today in the work that we all do as researchers, historians, public historians, curators, in that we're constantly sharing information, right? I found this person, and didn't you write about that person? Well, here's what I found. And I think that is a way in which that you respectfully honor the work that you do.
And does that relate to maybe next projects that you have in the hopper, Preeti, maybe?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. My next project looks at, so there is a man in the census in 1850 called George de Grasse, and he lists himself as being from India, and he was born in Calcutta. And I wrote a whole article about him. And again, talking about, I love historical figures because you think you've got them and you package it up and you're like, here's the narrative. And I speculated about how he was here and then what it meant for him to have married into the Black community, and he creates his family there. And, you know, in the 19th century archives, his children are said to have Asiatic features. Published the whole thing, and I was like, yeah, done. And then, again, talking about community and how we all work together. There is folks who are writing about Aaron Burr, the former vice president, who had a whole family out in the Caribbean. And Black descendants. And I started looking again at my archives, and I was like, wait a second. What if, is it possible that this person, George de Grasse, put himself down in the census as coming from India, Calcutta, in order to make himself racially legible to the census taker, and or was the census taker just a bit lazy and like, you look like you might be from that part of Asia, so I'm just going to put Calcutta because that's the obvious city. And actually what you have here is a really early example of Indo-Caribbean presence in the Americas. And so that is the next project.
Yeah, exciting. Another in the back up there.
You might have just answered my question, but I was wondering what the most surprising thing you found in the archives was when you were doing research for your book.
Thank you. God, I get asked this a lot, and I'm really trying to not sound like I had no surprises. Like I was so obvious to me that this was going to be the story. I don't know that there were surprises. I think I'll turn it into a positive. I think the surprise was as soon as stuff got digitized, I was so grateful, and I thought to myself, I can tell a much more richer story of everybody's life. Now I have access to probate records that I can just search. I'm not going to be in the archives for a month. But there was nothing truly surprising. I think I went in knowing somewhere deep down that this was absolutely a story of ordinary people, many of whose names have been forgotten to history and in the archives and to the landscapes and street names and the way in which we commemorate folks. And I think, yeah, I was just grateful that it all sort of came together.
Hi, thank you. This is a great discussion. I love it. And of course, we're in Brooklyn, so I'm a little biased. Tell the Bronx students I said that. Well, two things. One, I mean, I first moved to New York, working with Teach for America, living in Brooklyn, Grand Army Plaza, doing the long commute to the Bronx, to East Tremont. So imagine doing that for 2 years with Teach for America. And the one thing I came to realize in our city, as you were having that discussion with your students, is how provincial students are taught to be. It's not their fault, in all fairness. I think it's a disservice that we do to them. Our entire city, in some ways, does that. And so, you know, I'm teaching math and science, but I was always finding other reason to take my students to Manhattan to explore the city. I used to tell them plain out and simple, I'm the newbie here. I'm not a New Yorker. You are. This entire city is yours. So I would say to keep encouraging your students to sort of do that, because there's so many linkages. Even if you make a silly stand-up comedy joke about, you know, the sugar on your table was first started in Brooklyn. I mean, in all fairness, any various ways, just for students to kind of feel that sense of exploring the entire city, because there's so much great stuff about it and all these connections. Now, the question I have, I don't mean it to be in any way controversial, being you're not necessarily an American. I don't know if you change your citizenship, but I guess sometimes we're going through the process of deciding what we should do with certain monuments. And we were talking about various streets, and there's some movements by certain groups, and in some ways I'm probably supportive of that, to remove some of the names of certain streets that they know these particular families and individuals were, you know, slaveholders, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah. Again, not to put you on the spot. I don't want you to feel it's any controversial.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, just because I'm also asked the question a lot about commemoration. What do we do? And I think the answer is always we do multiple things, right? We don't do just any one thing. I'm all about co-street naming. I don't see any harm in it. I'm also a believer in, I think, not to get too deep with this, but I think it fulfills something so neoliberal to say, well, we removed the name, so therefore it's all good, right? We're fine now. And I think as an educator, there's such value to be had in thinking about what is the dark history of this particular, you know, enslaver or murderer or colonizer, and how did they end up here, and how does power work in terms of our landscapes? So I think we do multiple things. I think it is, you know, beautiful to create statues and commemorations and artwork. And I think that's really, again, being in community where it's not just the historians that do the work, right? Artists are brilliant thinkers about how we sort of commemorate and honor folks who are no longer here. So I think we do it all. I really do. You know, shout out to the historian Eric Washington, who is doing phenomenal work in Manhattan around a building in Chelsea, which he has found all the evidence and has got it landmarked. Around, you know, it's one of the former, as they called it in New York City in that time, colored schools, because black schools were so segregated, and is trying to get the street in Manhattan, of all places, you know, how do we co-name it? So I think that work is happening constantly. And I just think folks need to sort of shout about it and celebrate other people doing that work.
We have time for one more question right over here. And I'm going to say as I walk over here, I know it's going to be hard for people to resist coming up and talking to Prithi, and she knows so many people here. But please let her go back and sit and sign copies of the book and talk to her up there. So here's the last question.
Hi, mine is more of a comment because the person up front was asking about community, and I live on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I happen to live on a street that my brother told me about. I live in the community, and I never took the time to read it, but there is a plaque that denotes Catherine Market, which is where the Pinkster Festival took place. And people would come from Brooklyn on the ferry and go there to be in community with one another.
Thank you. I'm not going to add to that. I think that was a beautiful place to end. Yeah, that these places still exist. Thank you so much.
You can have just a little bit of appreciation for Prithi. And as Marcia mentioned, the book is now on sale, and Prithi will be available to sign your copy. I will put in a plug that no Zoom background screen. Your bookshelves are being judged, and if this yellow stripe isn't on there, I don't know how much of a Brooklynite you can call yourself. But thank you again so much for coming out, and looking forward to your thoughts about the book. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you to Dominique. Thank you.